The emperor was displeased at such an act of indiscretion as the burning of his letters. He disbelieved it at first and considered the answer as an excuse, the rather so as the idea of his intending to make an improper use of those letters was quite inconsistent with that of attempting to open a direct communication with England without the knowledge of the emperor, who could never account to himself for so glaring an act of folly. This was the time of his writing to me to obtain without delay all the particulars connected with that intrigue, which I was far from suspecting of so important a nature as it turned out to have been. It will be recollected that Monsieur Ouvrard was confined in the castle of Vincennes. I received orders to authorize the admission into the dungeon of a person belonging to the emperor's closet who was sent to him. This individual was Monsieur Meunier, at that time an auditor of the Council of State. I had first examined that my commission had been given to him for no other reason than my being considered as a novice in the business of the police. But I soon discovered the true cause of such a proceeding. I only learned a few years afterwards the details of the circumstances that had occasioned Monsieur Ouvrard's arrest. The emperor was told that he had gone over to England. This was the ground upon which he had been questioned. As, however, that assertion was false, the interrogatory could have no result, and it was found necessary to set him at liberty, since it was discovered that he had not quitted Holland, to which country he had been duly authorized to proceed. Monsieur Ouvrard was too shrewd a man to afford any hold upon him. He replied to Monsieur Meunier in no other way than by handing to him a letter for the emperor in which he vindicated himself from the charge. But the emperor mistrusted his assertions. The information hitherto obtained did not prove satisfactory. The emperor persisted in the opinion that someone had traveled from Paris to London, and he wished all inquiries to be directed to that point. I was still new to the duties of my office, but the great care with which I caused the registers of travelers going to or coming from England to be examined led me to discover that a Monsieur Fagin had performed the journey twice within a very short time. This Fagin was well known to the police, and I sent for him. He disguised nothing. He was an old Irish officer in the service of France who led a very questionable life in Paris, but had no reason to be ashamed of his public conduct. He assured me that whilst he was living in perfect retirement in Paris, he was visited by Monsieur Hennicar, a friend of his, who told him that the Duke of Otranto was in search of some person who might be entrusted with a mission to England, so delicate in its nature as to require a man of transcendent talents. Monsieur Hennicar had engaged to find out such a man, but requested the Duke would allow him to give some intimation to the person he had in view before he should divulge his name. Hennicar said to Fagin that the Duke of Otranto was entrusted with some business of a diplomatic nature, and that it was in his, Fagin's, power to create himself a name and greatly improve his circumstances by affording to the Minister of Police the aid of his services on this occasion. Fagin accepted the offer, and Hennicar desired him to present himself at the Hotel of the Duke of Otranto under any pretense that might occur to him. As the Duke could not be told of the purport of their conversation, in order that they might not raise any mistrust in the mind of the minister, who would assuredly not repose his confidence in a man capable of the smallest act of indiscretion, Hennicar's motive for urging so strongly upon Fagin the necessity of concealing from the Duke of Otranto that they had been together was that Hennicar himself had never seen the Duke of Otranto, and although he was an agent of the police, he was on this occasion instrumental to another intrigue. Fagin went to see the Duke, who had heard of his name in the same manner as Hennicar was known to him. He spoke to the minister the language of a devoted servant, alluded to the facilities he had for obtaining information in London, where he was intimately acquainted with the Marquis Wellesley, and concluded by tendering to the minister the office offers of his faithful services. Mr. Fouché gladly availed himself of this opportunity to unravel certain matters which were but imperfectly known to him through the correspondence with Amsterdam. And he did so the more readily as he had no suspicion of any snare, and as Fagin was actually an agent of the police. Accordingly, he provided this messenger to London with money as well as instructions, and pointed out to him a channel by which he might transmit his reports, with the view of their eluding the vigilance of the keenest observers. Fagin had scarcely received this mission when Henniker came to congratulate him on the occasion, and after the usual compliments, he told Fagin that he had yet another subject to open to him, on which his personal fortune mainly depended, and hinted at the possibility of his obtaining in some degree the Emperor's immediate protection against any capricious or unjust conduct of the Duke of Otranto, who was, perhaps after all, the dupe of some false report. Fagin requested Henniker to speak in plain language. The latter did so and said that if he would send him a copy of all the reports he might have to make to Mr. Fouché, it would assuredly be for his advantage, because the reports, said he, would be laid before the Emperor by the Duke of Bassano himself, who would, he added, receive them from Monsieur de S., to whom he will have been delivered by myself. Fagin, after considering for a few moments, accepted the offer, and as it was no difficult task for Henniker to persuade him of the necessity of the information being on all occasions forwarded to himself in the first instance, in order that he might be enabled to transmit his copy of the report as soon as Monsieur Fouché could present the original, it was agreed between them that one of the documents should precede the other by the interval of a courier. This point was no sooner settled than Mr. Fagin took his departure for London. I have now to relate the motives of the Duke of Otranto in sending him to England, and for the clearer illustration of my story, I shall take up the subject from its first origin. Chapter 25. Ever since his alliance with the House of Austria, the Emperor flattered himself that he had succeeded in his expectations, which had for object to bind a power of the first order to the system established in France, and accordingly to secure the peace of Europe. In other words, he thought he had no longer to apprehend any fresh coalition. Nothing was therefore left unaccomplished except a peace with England. And in order that Spain should no longer be a difficulty in the way, that the possession of Spain, in short, should cease to be a disputed point or a question to be brought into any negotiation on the part of France, whenever such negotiation might be entered into, he had ordered the advance to the peninsula of forces so imposing as to secure, in his opinion, the easy conquest of that country. The province of Castile was made their point of union, and they formed together a powerful army, of which was the Emperor's intention to assume the command. When, however, he had determined to remain in Paris, he sent Marshal Massena to supply his place, and instructed him to march at once against the English army in Portugal, whilst the army, under the orders of the king and of Marshal Soult, who performed the functions of Major General near his person, should advance upon Andalusia and Cadiz. These two grand operations were connected with the movements of General Suchet in Catalonia, where he successfully laid siege to the fortified towns which line the Ebro and protect that province. This extensive plan of operations had been drawn up by the Emperor himself, and he had indulged the hope that though he might be absent from the army, there would be no want of subordination or reluctant discharge of their respective duties on the part of those who were to aid those operations. The contrary, however, was the case, as will be related in its proper order of time. A peace with England was the subject to which his attention was principally directed. He found himself provided with adequate means for offering compensations to her as an equivalent for what he should have to claim from that power in return for the sacrifices that might be demanded of him on grounds not sufficiently strong to enforce such demands. For such, in fact, was our position, that unless England could be prevailed upon to consent to a peace, there could be no end to the war. The intervention of Russia had been twice resorted to for bringing about a negotiation with the English government, and it had been rejected by the latter in terms which did not even afford the means of calling upon her for the grounds of her refusal. So that it was still the prevailing opinion in England that the emperor's ambition extended to the possession of a general sway over the continent of Europe, whilst in France it was imagined that England contemplated to secure to herself a maritime and commercial power which would not tolerate the existence of any other. Notwithstanding such extreme views of contending policy, the emperor could not give up all hope of procuring a favorable hearing for reasonable proposals on his part in return for those which he was willing to listen to. He sought the means of sounding the views of the English government for the purpose of ascertaining how far he was justified in not banishing all hope of an accommodation. It was necessary that a measure of this nature should be secretly resorted to, otherwise it would have shown his intentions in too open a manner, and in case of refusal the consequences would have all recoiled upon the emperor. Holland stood much more in need of a maritime peace than France itself. King Louis enjoyed the good opinion of his subjects and frankly told the emperor of the personal inconvenience he should feel in being seated for a much longer time upon the throne of a country wholly bereft of its resources, and deeply mortified at the recent annexation to France of a portion of its territory. He was the first to open a correspondence with England with the emperor's approbation. It was carried on under the disguise of a mere commercial intercourse. The firm of Hope at Amsterdam transacted more business with England than any other house, and owing to the high consideration which it enjoyed, that house might, whilst carrying on its commercial affairs, be vested without any impropriety with the character which the state matters between both governments would require it to assume. It had for one of its partners Monsieur de la Bouchère, who was connected by family ties with one of the first mercantile men in London. The choice of the King of Holland fell upon him for the mission which he had undertaken to set on foot. He gave his instructions to Monsieur de la Bouchère with a passport to enable him to reach London. No suspicion could attach to him, as his appearance and intercourse in that city were the natural results of his family connection there, and he was accordingly unshackled by any of those obstacles which might otherwise have impeded his proceedings. His character likewise stood so high with everyone that no doubt or mistrust could attach to any observations he might have to make. Monsieur de la Bouchère addressed his reports in the firm of Hope at Amsterdam, who handed them to the king. From the latter they found their way to the emperor. Monsieur de la Bouchère's first dispatches were not only of a satisfactory nature in respect to the dispositions with which the British government had met him, they were moreover encouraging, and he expressed the hope that if mutual concessions were made in perfect frankness, everything might be so arranged as to answer the impatient desire of all parties, because the question of reciprocal sacrifices would no sooner come under discussion and the first step be taken, then all important points would be easily settled, and nothing would remain but questions of little consequence when put into comparison with the enormous losses constantly occasioned by this unrelenting state of warfare. Matters were going on prosperously. The Duke of Otranto was informed of Monsieur de la Bouchère's being in England, and information which he may have obtained through the mercantile correspondence between London and Paris, or between London and Amsterdam and Paris. The intelligence so communicated to him was accomplished with details sufficiently interesting to excite the curiosity of the Duke of Otranto, who might, besides, have another motive for his anxiety to know them. For a minister of police is justified in suspecting everything. On the present occasion, however, he appears to have had a mere desire to learn what events were brooding in the political horizon in order to regulate by them his own movements. It was easy for him to acquire correct knowledge of what Monsieur de la Bouchère was doing in London, this person being on terms of great intimacy with Monsieur Ouvrard. He accordingly sent for the latter, spoke to him of certain circumstances which were calculated to favor speculations, told him in short, without testifying the smallest degree of curiosity, that he held this conversation with him by the emperor's consent, and proposed that he should proceed to Amsterdam to act the part of an agent between him, Fouché, and Monsieur de la Bouchère, who was in London, and with whom he was to open a communication on the moment of his arrival in order to find out what was doing in the English capital, and send him his reports to Paris from Amsterdam, where he was to remain. Monsieur Fouché had not yet stated a word of all this to the emperor, who on his part had for a long time past acted with the utmost reserve towards him. Monsieur Ouvrard could have no reason to suspect that the minister was making an improper use of the emperor's name. He therefore proceeded to Amsterdam under the conviction of being sent there by the emperor's order, and wrote accordingly to Monsieur de la Bouchère, who, without at all deviating from the course marked out for him previously to his departure from Holland, continued addressing his reports to the firm of Hope for the purpose of their being communicated to the king, who sent them forward to the emperor. Nevertheless, as he was intimately acquainted with Monsieur Ouvrard, he acknowledged the receipt of his letters, and perhaps with the view of keeping himself aloof from the slightest suspicion of private intrigue, with which his character for discretion might have been aspersed if matters had taken an unfavorable turn, he resolved to make an open and unreserved avowal to Monsieur Ouvrard of what was going on and what he expected to accomplish. He felt the less reluctant at this course, as he was at perfect liberty to take advantage of a favorable opportunity for engaging in any great commercial speculation that might present itself to him. After Monsieur Fouché had received the first letters which Monsieur Ouvrard wrote to him as to a person whom he had only supposed acquainted with the fact of Monsieur de la Bouchère's mission, but also entrusted to direct its progress, whom he considered in short as the real negotiator between France and England, he then, and then only, spoke to the emperor of Monsieur Ouvrard's journey to Holland, adding, not that he had sent him there, but that he had seen no reason for refusing him a passport, especially as he was in correspondence with the firm of Hope, with whom he had accounts to settle, and that Ouvrard occasionally supplied him with news. Monsieur Fouché fancied himself sufficiently in a rule after making his report to the emperor, and he even mentioned Monsieur Ouvrard's journey, with no other intention than to protect himself from blame if matters had failed of success, and in such case to impute the failure to Monsieur Ouvrard himself. The emperor treasured up in his mind this circumstance, which did not encourage his being more communicative with Monsieur Fouché, who was reduced to the necessity of guessing at what was going on in London from the reports sent to him from Amsterdam by Monsieur Ouvrard in consequence of Monsieur de la Bouchère's letters to him. The latter was too shrewd a man to commit to paper what ought not to be spoken in conversation, so that Monsieur Fouché's curiosity was constantly excited, though never gratified. Enough, however, was known to convince him that the emperor was endeavoring to bring about a peace, and he therefore concluded that his language ought to harmonize with that object. He set to work at the same time with the view of reaping some credit to himself in the business of pacification by doing everything that was calculated to deceive the people and impress them with the idea that he had brought it about or caused the attempt to be made. He went boldly to work because he made sure of the result and felt satisfied that the emperor had openly entered upon the negotiations. He mentioned it to some individuals that they might take care to repeat it, and he neglected no means that were calculated to afford him regular information of the progress of the question, of which he had but a superficial knowledge without being able to acquire a thorough insight into it. It was a source of uneasiness to him, however, that as it was his practice to take credit to himself every popular act, his foresight would have failed him, and his credit accordingly had been affected if peace had been concluded without his being previously informed of what was in contemplation. It was by these anticipations of a peace with England, which he promised to everyone, that he attracted attention to his conduct, and that the Duke of Bassano, or Monsieur de S., came to learn that Monsieur Fouché was discussing a peace with England through the channel of Monsieur Ouvrard, who was at Amsterdam, and it was added that the latter had already performed several voyages to and from Amsterdam to London. Motives of curiosity, or perhaps a jealousy, on the part of those who having brought about the emperor's marriage, were ambitious of holding some of the high appointments, perhaps office which was aimed at by Monsieur Fouché himself, made them form the determination of defeating his plan or his intrigue if it were found that he had been conspiring against the state. This task was rendered easy to them by Hennicar, whom Monsieur de S had brought over to his interests. Hennicar, on his side, although connected with the mystery police, had won over the two Vera, father and son, who both held some superior employments in the prefecture of police, which was generally in a state of rivalry towards the general administration of the department. By which means, when it was intended to deceive Monsieur Fouché, a mischievous bulletin was placed in the hands of Hennicar, who handed it over to Vera, and the latter to the prefect of police, by whom it was reserved as a police antidote for the private information of the emperor. It was by such pitiful means that the progress of the most important affairs was impeded, whilst a great display was made of an unbounded zeal for the emperor's service. I am unable to affirm whether Monsieur de Bassano reported to the emperor that Monsieur Fouché was in open negotiation with England through the channel of Ouvre, and whether the emperor had in consequence directed him to ascertain what Monsieur Ouvre might be doing in Amsterdam or in London, or if inquiries were first set on foot by Monsieur de Bassano before he made a report to the emperor. I always understood, however, that the first communication was made to him by the prefecture of police in the manner I have just related. Be that as it may, I can vouch for the following fact. After having taken the deposition of Monsieur Fagin, whose name has been lately mentioned, I sent for Monsieur Hennicar and spoke to him rather roughly in these words: "Although, sir, you have made me so many proffers of service, have complained of the Duke of Otranto's ingratitude towards the emperor, and have so highly approved of Monsieur Ouvre's arrest, I now find that you are much more deserving of imprisonment. And if you do not give me a plain and candid answer, this may very soon be your lot. By whose desire did you engage Fagin to undertake a mission to England?" He replied with a dejected air and an alarmed tone of voice that he had certainly been the originator of the proposal and not Fagin, that the measure had been agreed upon between Monsieur de S and himself, and that without such an intrigue on their part they never should have succeeded in effecting Monsieur Fouché's downfall and procuring my accession to his office. "How was this?" I replied. "Without knowing me? You felt desirous of doing me that signal service." He endeavored to dupe me by saying that public opinion marked me out as the only man amongst the devoted attendants upon the emperor who was capable of properly fulfilling the duties of that department, etc., etc. He related to me, in short, all that I have mentioned as having taken place between Fagin and himself, adding that what he had done was in concert with S, to whom he invariably handed the bulletins which Fagin forwarded to him. It appears, therefore, that Monsieur Fouché, whose talent has been so highly extolled, had employed in a circumstance of so delicate a nature as affecting his own character an agent who, though receiving a salary from him, had been thrust upon him by Monsieur de S, who was actually compassing his ruin. If Monsieur de S was not acting in concert with Monsieur de Bassano, he assuredly deceived him when he delivered Fagin's bulletins into his hands as if they were derived from another source. If otherwise, Monsieur Fouché has been completely the dupe of both. I have not yet alluded to Monsieur Fouché's motive for sending Fagin to London. It may have been of a twofold nature. In the first place, as Fagin asserted that he had the means of obtaining access to the Marquis Wellesley, Monsieur Fouché might thereby acquire a knowledge of the state of the question with the ministers and of the proposals of that party, of which Monsieur de la Bouchère was the organ, and by the correspondence of Fagin, who had been admitted to an interview with the Marquis Wellesley, compared with that of Ouvre, which was an extract of the correspondence of Monsieur de la Bouchère, who had also an interview with Lord Wellesley. He might almost succeed in ascertaining the intentions of each of the parties, anticipate the result, and discover at the same time, by conjecture, What were the instructions that guided the proceedings of the negotiators? On Monsieur Fagin's return from his first voyage, Monsieur Fouché no longer doubted the success of the negotiations and made his arrangements accordingly, either to claim the credit in public opinion of having brought England to conclude a peace, an object which had hitherto baffled every attempt, or to take up the threat of the negotiation at the opportune moment when the emperor might have both the will and the means of treating openly, because he would have then told him that he was fully informed of the state of the question and had never lost sight of it. A merit sufficiently great in his estimation to obtain for him the rank of negotiator at the emperor's hands, and eventually that of minister for foreign affairs, which he aimed at as a relief from the deputies of the police department. Such was his motive for sending Fagin to London. He was, however, in too great a hurry to act the part of a negotiator, and went astray like a man who should pretend to show the road to those who have not said in what direction they were traveling. He sent his messenger back to London, from whence he had lately returned, after having seen and conversed with Marquis Wellesley. He again presented himself before this minister, to whom he related certain conversations, perhaps some of a frivolous nature, held by his brother minister, Monsieur Fouché, and who might be supposed in London to have been empowered by the emperor to negotiate. Fagin, therefore, was now vested with a kind of diplomatic character, since the Marquis Wellesley might place as much reliance on what Fagin communicated to him on the part of Monsieur Fouché, as the latter appeared to have shown to Fagin's reports of his conversations with the Marquis. Unfortunately, however, for Monsieur Fouché, what Fagin told Lord Wellesley did not at all coincide with the subject matter of Monsieur de la Bouchere's conversation, of which Fouché could not be so quickly informed, because what was to be sent to Monsieur de la Bouchere was addressed from Paris to the King of Holland direct, and afterwards to London, and Monsieur Fouché could not acquire a knowledge of those dispatches until their contents had found their way back, whenever Monsieur de la Bouchere should think proper to make a communication respecting them to Monsieur Ouvrard, whom he supposed to have been apprised of the motive of his stay in London. The result of all this medley and confusion was that the Marquis Wellesley was justified in supposing that an attempt was made to deceive him, or that Monsieur de la Bouchere was forced to act the part of a dupe in order to flatter the Dutch with the hopes of peace, since he spoke to him in one language, when at the moment Monsieur Fouché made him speak in another, which was not altogether consistent with the former. He entertained little doubt of the sincerity of the individual who had the audacity to assume an official character, and reserved his suspicions for the other, who was nevertheless better entitled to his confidence, but who, not being authorized to assume any character, might be disavowed at pleasure. He endeavored to satisfy himself as to which of the two agents he was to place faith in, and finding nothing but contradictions in the accounts of either, he saw only a tissue of intrigue in the matter, ceased all communications with both, and shortly afterwards ordered them to quit England, observing that if France were really desirous of peace, she might resort to other means for conveying her proposals. It was impossible to conceal from the emperor Monsieur de la Bouchere's return to Amsterdam. The mission of Mr. Fagin to London had been kept secret from him, Fagin's bulletins, conveyed to him by Monsieur de S, being only handed in as bulletins of Monsieur Fouché's negotiation without any further explanation. The emperor knew of nothing more than Monsieur Ouvrard's departure for Amsterdam, and as great care was taken to conceal from his knowledge the departure of Fagin for England, a fact which was perhaps not known even to Monsieur de Bassanot. He naturally ascribed to Monsieur Ouvrard's those bulletins of Monsieur Fouché's negotiations. The emperor was therefore under the impression that Monsieur Ouvrard had gone in person to London, and he gave orders for his arrest accordingly. He was driven to it by the representations made to him that Monsieur Ouvrard's name was only a cloak for Monsieur de Talleyrand, whom it was wished to remove as a man that excited great apprehension. I leave it to all enlightened men to form their opinion respecting this business, which bears a greater resemblance to low cunning than to the higher class of intrigue. Let them, after unraveling all these snares laid against a confiding good faith, pronounce which of the parties has been the most guilty. Chapter 26. It became necessary to renounce the hope of concluding peace, a circumstance which was productive of still worse effects in Holland than in France. The majority of the commercial body gave themselves up to despair. The king himself, whose predilection for retired life was ill calculated for such stormy times, was frightened at the mere anticipation of disturbances which he considered as unavoidable, no doubt feeling himself wanting in the energy of character requisite for opposing them, and he gave way to his natural inclination. He determined on a sudden to abdicate a power which had been, as it were, forced upon him, without being deterred by the apprehension of exposing the emperor to fresh embarrassments arising out of his leaving Holland without any government in consequence of his abrupt departure. It is true that by the act of abdication he had appointed the queen to be regent, but it was not in a recently created monarchy like Holland that a foreign queen could exercise any sovereignty, especially as she was still less calculated than her husband to apply a remedy to evils, the apprehension of which had made him determined to withdraw from the scene. It was impossible not to perceive that one of the two things must necessarily come to pass, either that the government would be strong enough to put down the disaffected, a term which might be applied to the whole Dutch nation, or that the latter would shake off the yoke and call in the English. Could then a female regent, a stranger to the country, and suddenly placed at the head of affairs, collect forces sufficiently imposing to command respect for her authority, and to enable her to repress disturbances, even supposing that, although young and inexperienced, she possessed sufficient moral strength to be unmoved at the heart-rending sight of an unhappy and divided nation, which would have infallibly laid to her charge all the misfortunes that oppressed it? In a state of peace and tranquility, when a correct and enlightened mind combined with a generous and elevated character are qualities sufficient for governing, Holland could not have been under a happier sway than that of its queen regent. But the times were not of such a cheering complexion, and there were other interests to be attended to of much more paramount importance to those in that country. Much blame has been thrown upon the King of Holland for his conduct. He has been generally reproached for deserting a nation which did justice to his qualities and had given him proofs of fidelity and obedience to his service, for having, by his abdication, exposed him to evils which he might have averted by preserving them from an inseparable consequences of total dissolution of government. He has been reproached, in short, with having, by that act of abdication, marked out the emperor as the originator of this voluntary sacrifice, whilst it was much more to a consideration for his health and to his fondness for retirement that this sacrifice was to be ascribed than to the emperor's influence over Holland, an influence, however, which was much less considerable than under the elective government of that country at an earlier period. The emperor had good reason for saying occasionally, when he spoke of his brothers, that they were no sooner invested with power than they adopted the policy of the government to which they had succeeded, so that he had gained little by the change, and he added that it would be no greater expense if those countries over which they held sway were governed by viceroys. The King of Holland had no sooner signed his abdication than he took his departure in the strictest incognito, passed through Westphalia, which was under the dominion of his brother, and afterwards through Saxony on his way, it was said, to the waters of Toplitz in Bohemia. He then retired to Graz in Styria, where he took up his residence as a private individual. The emperor was at the palace of Rambouillet when he received the intelligence of his brother's abdication. The first news of it had arrived at Paris in commercial letters, and as the official dispatches were silent on the subject, he felt apprehensive of some underhand plots going on in that country, of which the king's retirement would probably have been one of the results previously agreed on. This idea remained fixed for a short time in his mind until the general officer who commanded his troops in Holland dispelled every doubt by the measures he had adopted for the purpose of preventing the Dutch troops from taking part in a foreign movement, which is believed to be connected with the party at whose instigation the king was supposed to have abdicated the crown. The rigorous enforcement of the continental system had become the emperor's sheet anchor, inasmuch as no other means could be devised for compelling England to agree to a peace. That system, which had to stand such severe attacks from public opinion, had been maturely weighed and boldly carried into execution. At the risk of anticipating a little upon the order of events, I may be allowed to call to my assistance in this place the unsuspected testimony of the Emperor Alexander. During the year 1814, that monarch was in the habit of visiting the Empress Maria Louisa at the Palace of Schönbrunn. He met there Monsieur de Meneval, whom he soon recognized, and in the course of conversation he told him that during his late excursion to England after the Peace of Paris, he was desirous of satisfying himself as to the practicability of the views contemplated by the continental system. He had not confined himself to mere oral information. He had visited Manchester, Birmingham, and the large manufacturing towns of England. He had seen, examined, and questioned with the utmost care, and brought back the conviction that if the system had lasted another year, England must of necessity have yielded. The conception, he added, was a happy and a mighty one, the extent of which he had never viewed in his proper light. What the Emperor Alexander's penetration had only discovered in 1814 had been foreseen in the outset by the genius of the Emperor Napoleon. He accordingly attached great importance to the carrying into effect of measures so effectual and yet so little understood. Holland required to be more closely watched than any other part of Europe in consequence of its numberless rivers and the variety of forms which its commercial transactions assume. The emperor had often occasion to complain to King Louis of the neglect shown along the coast of his dominions in the execution of the system which interested both countries in an equal degree, owing, however, to a spirit of opposition and obstinacy which the emperor was never able to overcome, and to his underhand proceedings King Louis injured instead of assisted him. It cannot be denied that his abdication and flight seriously affected the emperor's cause in public opinion. It was related to me by a person who was near the emperor when he received the news of that event that he never saw him so much struck with astonishment. He remained silent for a few moments, and after a kind of momentary stupor, suddenly appeared to be greatly agitated. He was not then aware of the influence which that circumstance would have over political affairs. His mind was exclusively taken up with his brother's ingratitude. His heart was ready to burst when he exclaimed, "Was it possible to suspect so mischievous a conduct in the brother most indebted to me? When I was a mere lieutenant of artillery, I brought him up with the scanty means which my pay afforded me. I divided my bread with him, and this is the return he makes for my kindness?" Emperor was so overpowered by his emotion that his grief was said to have vented itself in sobs. King Louis wished to claim credit to himself for descending from the throne without having amassed any fortune, and he propagated the report that he was living in distress at Gratz. He disdainfully refused the dowry which the emperor allowed to the queen, and inserted in foreign newspapers a protest against it. It does not become me to discuss a question of a personal nature. It would not, however, be difficult to enumerate all that Louis Bonaparte owed to the emperor's bounty, and I might also relate how he cheated his benefactor, who reproached him on his deathbed by his political will for having published against him a book supported by garbled and even false documents. It never was the Emperor's wish to oppress Holland. He had even consented to every measure calculated to relieve the situation of the Dutch without paralyzing the effects of its system. He had granted licenses and other commercial privileges, but in the aspect which public affairs had assumed, what course was he to pursue? Was he to abandon Holland to itself? Unquestionably so. If he intended it to become immediately a province of England, and to place us in still more critical position towards the latter country.